Ever wonder what happens to those photos taken at, like, public events? Who owns them? Can they be used however anyone wants?
Yeah.
Well, get ready to dive into this fascinating legal case. It's about a photo that ended up in Vibe magazine
Oh,
back in 2006.
Vibe, huh?
Yeah, it might seem like, just celebrity gossip,
Right.
but this case really gets to the heart of privacy rights and freedom of the press,
Yeah.
something that affects all of us.
It really does. It's a classic example of how New York civil rights law tries to balance these competing interests. You see, celebrities, they do have legal protection when it comes to their image. And this case really shines a light on how those protections work in the real world.
So let's set the scene. Back in 2003, Sean Combs,
Okay.
Puff Daddy, P. Diddy.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, he threw one of his famous white parties in East Hampton.
Ah.
These were massive events. And this one in particular ended up, being the center of our legal story. So Vibe magazine, they did a feature article on Sean Combs a few years later.
Okay.
In November of 2006. And included some photos from those parties.
Okay.
Seems harmless enough.
Well, one of the pictures from the 2003 party, it showed 3 women dressed as mermaids.
Okay.
The catch, they were topless.
Oh, wow.
And one of those women, Maria Kristina Dominguez, she decided to take legal action because she said she never consented to being photographed topless or having that image published.
So Dominguez sued Vibe magazine, Sean Combs, and Bad Boy Entertainment,
Oh.
saying they violated her privacy. Her argument was based on New York civil rights law,
Right.
which basically says you can't use someone's image for commercial purposes without their permission. That seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. But the defendants, they had a pretty strong defense.
Okay.
They claimed the newsworthiness exception applied in this case.
Yeah.
They argued that the photo was part of a story about Sean Combs, a public figure, and his well-known party, which, by its very nature, attracts public interest.
Okay, so we've got this legal battle brewing an individual's right to privacy versus freedom of the press. What did the court have to say about all this?
Well, the judge sided with the defendants
Oh,
and dismissed the case.
wow.
The key here was the real relationship test.
Okay.
The judge ruled that the photo did have a real relationship to the article about Sean Combs.
Okay.
What's interesting is that the court, they even acknowledged that the picture might have boosted the magazine's sales, but that didn't mean it wasn't related to the story.
So even though the magazine might have benefited commercially, the context of the photo within the article mattered more.
Yeah,
That's a pretty nuanced distinction.
exactly. And there's another point in the ruling that I think is really fascinating.
Okay.
The judge basically said it wasn't their job to question the magazine's editorial decisions about what's newsworthy, as long as those decisions were reasonable.
Wait, so who decides what's reasonable?
Right.
Doesn't that give publishers a lot of power?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of how the law tries to balance these, complicated issues. It's not always, black and white.
Right.
The court, they look at things like the article's content, the photo's prominence, and the context of the publication
All right.
to figure out if that newsworthiness exception applies.
So there's some wiggle room, but it's not a free pass for publishers.
Right.
They still have to be able to defend their choices in court.
Yeah.
This newsworthiness exception seems like a pretty big deal. Where did it come from?
Well, it's deeply rooted in the Hearst Amendment
Okay.
and the idea that a free press is vital to a functioning democracy. The courts have long recognized that journalists need a certain level of protection to report on matters of public concern without fear of being sued for every photo or piece of information they publish.
Okay, so it's about balancing the public's need for information with an individual's right to privacy.
Right.
But how do we ensure that this newsworthiness exception isn't abused? Where do we draw the line?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that courts grapple with constantly. There are limitations to the exception. It's not a carte blanche for publishers to do whatever they want.
Right.
For example, simply because someone is at a public event doesn't automatically strip them of all privacy rights.
That makes sense. So going back to Dominguez, even though she was at a public party, the court still had to consider whether using her photo in that specific way was justified under this exception.
Precisely. And this is where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
Remember, Dominguez wasn't a public figure like Sean Combs.
Right.
She was, for all intents and purposes, an average person who happened to be at this event.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this case really raises questions about what happens when, everyday people, not just celebrities, find themselves in the spotlight. Like, I mean, you could be at a concert
Yeah.
or a sporting event and end up in a photo that gets published. Does that mean anyone can just use your image without your consent?
Well, it's not quite that simple.
Okay.
The context matters a lot. In Dominguez's case, the court focused on the real relationship between her photo and the article's subject matter.
Okay.
The connection to the story about Sean Combs and his parties, that was really key to the ruling.
So if someone had just snapped a random picture of her at the grocery store
Right.
and tried to sell it to a tabloid, that would be a different story.
Absolutely. The newsworthiness exception wouldn't apply there because
Wow.
there's no clear connection to a newsworthy event
Yeah.
or a public figure.
This makes me think about those paparazzi photos you see of celebrities doing, like, everyday things.
Yeah.
Where do those fit in?
The paparazzi.
Yeah.
They operate in a bit of a gray area, legally and ethically. Celebrities might be public figures, but they still have some expectation of privacy,
Okay.
especially when it comes to their personal lives.
Yeah.
So the courts have to weigh those interests against the public's interest in seeing those images.
It feels like things get even more complicated with, like, social media.
Oh, yeah.
Anyone can be a photographer and publisher these days.
Right.
Imagine you're at a concert and someone in the crowd, they snap a photo of you dancing
Yeah.
and post it online. Do they need your permission?
That's a great question. And it highlights how technology is constantly pushing the boundaries of these legal concepts. The law is still catching up to the realities of social media and, widespread image sharing.
So what are the key takeaways for our listener here? What should they keep in mind when it comes to their own photos and privacy in this, like, wild world of digital photography?
Well, I think awareness is key.
Okay.
When you're in public, especially at events where photography is common, there's always a chance that someone might capture your image. You might not have much control over that initial act of taking the picture, but you do have legal options if your image is used in a way that violates your privacy rights.
So knowing your rights is crucial. This case also brings up some, like, ethical questions for anyone taking and sharing photos, even casually on social media.
Yeah.
Just because you can post something doesn't mean you should.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Even if something is technically legal, it doesn't automatically mean it's the right thing to do.
Right.
We all have a responsibility to consider the potential impact our actions might have on others.
You mentioned earlier that the court didn't want to second guess the magazine's editorial decisions about what's considered newsworthy,
Right.
as long as those decisions were reasonable. But who ultimately gets to define what's reasonable?
That's a tricky one.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer. The courts have to consider a whole range of factors, like, the content of the article, how prominently the photo is displayed, and the individual's expectation of privacy in that particular situation. It's very case specific.
It seems like a lot of responsibility falls on journalists and publishers to make, ethical choices, even if the law gives them some leeway.
Exactly. This case really underscores the importance of responsible journalism. While the law provides a framework, it's ultimately up to those in the media to weigh the public's right to know against an individual's right to privacy.
This conversation has been incredibly insightful. It really makes you think twice about the power of images and the responsibility that comes with taking and sharing them.
That's what's so fascinating about this topic. The more we explore it, the more we realize how complex and nuanced it really is, and how technology continues to challenge our understanding of these issues.
We've covered a lot of ground, but I feel like there's still more to unpack. Yeah. The judge's decision not to question the magazine's judgment about what's newsworthy, that really stuck with me. Yeah. It makes you wonder about the balance of power in these situations.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It raises questions about the boundaries of editorial freedom and whether there should be more checks and balances in place.
Right. If the courts are reluctant to step in, does that mean it's up to the media to, like, police itself? And what happens when different publications have vastly different ideas of what's considered newsworthy?
You've hit on a crucial issue. Who gets to be the gatekeeper of what the public sees and knows?
Yeah.
These are questions that have been debated for centuries, and they're even more relevant now in the age of digital media,
Right.
where information spreads so rapidly.
It's a lot to consider. And it goes beyond like legal arguments to encompass ethical and societal questions about the kind of world we want to live in.
Well said. It's about finding a balance that protects individual rights,
Mm-hmm.
while also allowing for a free and open flow of information.
So for our listener who might be thinking, this is all interesting, but what does it mean for me? What's the bottom line here?
I think the biggest takeaway is that everyone has a role to play in shaping the future of privacy and freedom of expression. Whether you're a journalist, a photographer, or simply someone who uses social media, being aware of these issues and making conscious choices is crucial.
So we talked about how the court emphasized the real relationship between Dominguez's photo and the Vibe article about Sean Combs. Can you give our listener a better understanding of what the courts consider a real relationship? What are they looking for exactly?
Well, it's not about whether the photo is, aesthetically pleasing or even if it's the most important piece of the story.
Right.
The courts are mainly concerned with whether the photo, genuinely contributes to the article's narrative. Does it help tell the story? Does it provide context or understanding that words alone can't convey?
So it's not just about throwing in a random picture for shock value.
Right.
Or to, boost sales.
Sure. Right.
There has to be a legitimate connection to the subject matter.
Exactly. And the courts will look at the article as a whole, not just the photo in isolation.
Okay.
They'll consider the captions, the surrounding text, and the overall message the publication is trying to convey.
This is where that editorial judgment comes into play again, right?
Yeah.
The publisher has to make a case for why that specific photo is necessary to tell that particular story.
Precisely. And while the courts generally give publishers some leeway in making those decisions, it's not a blank check.
Okay.
If the connection between the photo and the story is weak, or if the photo is deemed to be, excessively intrusive or exploitative, the court might step in and say, hold on, this crosses the line.
So there's a balance to be struck between protecting freedom of the press and safeguarding individual privacy rights.
That's the crux of it. And this case really highlights how difficult it can be to find that sweet spot. There's no easy formula, and the courts are constantly grappling with these complex issues.
This entire deep dive has been so illuminating. It really makes you think about the power of images and the responsibility we all have in this digital age.
I agree. It's a conversation that we need to be having, especially as technology continues to blur the lines between, public and private.
So any final thoughts for our listener who's now armed with all this knowledge about privacy, photography, and the law? What's the one thing you want them to take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important message is that awareness is key.
Yeah.
Be mindful of the images you capture and share, both as a photographer and as a consumer of media. Think about the stories behind those images and the potential impact they might have.
Well said. It's about being thoughtful and respectful, even in a world that's increasingly driven by visuals.
Exactly. And remember, the law is constantly evolving to keep pace with technology and societal norms. So stay informed, stay curious, and keep questioning the world around you.
That's great advice. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive. And a huge thanks to you, our listener, for tuning in. Until next time, keep exploring.